The intake manifold is a cast aluminum set of pipes that delivers air to the engine. A naturally aspirated internal combustion engine such as the Jeep 4-liter will create vacuum while it's running. That vacuum sucks air into the combustion chamber through the intake manifold after being regulated by the throttle body and passing through the air filter. The intake manifold also has a handful of other jobs. It mounts the fuel injectors, various sensors, the entire throttle body, and provides vacuum to various other systems in the vehicle that rely on it. With a leak anywhere in this vacuum-sealed system, the idle air control valve won't be able to regulate the additional air sneaking past it, and your engine will idle too high as if you constantly have your foot on the gas pedal. You may also lose functionality of some vacuum-actuated things like cruise control, the heater vents, or the evap system. This will likely display error P1294, target idle not reached, and that's exactly what's happening in my situation. Most of the time, vacuum leaks are caused when a random and seemingly insignificant vacuum line pops off its fitting. In the case of this Jeep, the owner noted his heater vents only worked on the defrost setting, and that was fixed by literally just plugging this vacuum line back in.
Well, I bet they'll work now.
In my case, it's a bit more severe. The gasket which separates the manifolds from the engine decided to give up on life, and you can hear it screaming in agony at warm idle.
It's obnoxious.
In this video, I'll be demonstrating the removal and installation process for the intake manifold on the 1999 to 2006 Jeep 4-liter. However, note this process is pretty much the same on the older engines with the rectangular shaped intake. They usually just have things mounted in slightly different locations. Here's all the tools we're going to need for the job. You need sockets from 8 to 15 millimeter, as well as a 1/2 inch, a 9/16, a 9/16 deep socket, and a 10 millimeter deep socket. You might need a screwdriver. You're definitely going to want all three types of extensions. We got a long, a medium, and a short one here, as well as a swivel joint extension. Depending on how good your memory is, you might want some masking tape and a Sharpie to write down where some connectors go. Other than that, a torque wrench and a 3/8 quick disconnect tool. I just kind of have a whole set, but you're only going to need this one. Our first step is to disconnect the battery at the negative terminal. Although not necessary, we are working directly with the fuel system, so it's a good idea not to chance anything. Next, remove the airbox, which as you can see I don't have bolted down because I find myself taking the damn thing out every 15 minutes. Now I'll detach the throttle cables, unbolt the bracket, and move them out of the way. Now, if you've never done this before, there are a hefty amount of electrical connectors to be concerned about. Using masking tape and a Sharpie, I labeled every one we'll have to disconnect. If anything, all you really need to label are the fuel injector connectors because they're the only ones that can be mixed up. With them all labeled, let's get them out of the way. The front side of the throttle body will have your intake air temperature sensor and the manifold absolute pressure sensor. The back of the throttle body has the idle air control valve and the throttle position sensor. The O2 sensor connectors need their tab to be pulled outwards instead of pressed in. The red lock tabs on the fuel injectors like to fly off and break, so try to be careful with them. The California emissions models will have their Bank 1 Sensor 2 connector routed all the way down here, so don't forget that one. Also don't forget the small plastic mount by the fuel line. With all the wires unplugged, the plastic guide for them can pop upwards off the cylinder head bolts. This thing is really easy to break, so try to apply even pressure on it best you can. Then it's just a matter of routing everything out of the way. Along with the wires, the 5 vacuum lines can come off and be shoved somewhere. The upstream O2 sensors on California emissions models have their connectors mounted to small brackets shared with the fuel rail. A 10 millimeter deep socket will remove the nuts, and then you can just put the brackets off to the side. If so equipped, remove the fuel rail heat shield so we can access the manifold bolts later. The fuel line is next. Before we take that off, we need to relieve fuel pressure so we can get the fuel line off. But before we take the fuel line off, don't forget about this little sucker down here. 10mm deep socket. Take this bracket off. Take the cap off this Schrader valve and press it in with something to relieve the fuel pressure. Usually you'll get a lot more than this, and it may be worth using a paper towel or a cup or something, but the Jeep's been sitting overnight, so there's hardly nothing left. Pry this safety lock off and then slide your quick disconnect tool into place. The power steering pump comes off next, which we need to remove the radiator fan to get at. The connector, 2 8mm bolts on top, and the coolant overflow hose are all that stand between us and belt tension. The last thing in our way is the power steering pump. In order to get this off, we have to loosen the belt. In order to do that, first loosen this 15mm bolt on that pulley right here. You don't need to take it out, just loosen it. And then this 15mm bolt right here, put a long extension on that, loosen that for, a good while until there's enough slack. Pop the belt off. Using a short extension with a 1/2-inch socket, you can remove these bolts through holes on the pulley. When all three are out, you can just set the pump where the airbox used to be. We're ready to remove the manifold. There are 11 bolts in total, only 8 of which secure the intake. Using this diagram I made, we can see bolts 3, 6, and 7 only secure the exhaust, so for now we're not going to remove those ones. The top 4 are easy to access, ignoring this middle one for now, but don't remove those yet. The bottom 4 are pretty challenging. You'll have to get these by feel. Start on the top, but only crack these free, don't take them out all the way. This should give you a sense of how tight the bolts on the underside will be. For each bolt, I'll show what combinations of extensions I used in the top corner of the screen. It doesn't matter which one you loosen first, so I like to start at the most difficult to reach one at the back and work forward. The swivel joint comes in handy for bolts 10, 8, and 9. For the underside bolts, you can use the intake runners as a reference point. Bolt number 5 is directly below this corner here. From this angle, you cannot see the bolt at all. You have to do this entirely by feel, but yes, I can confirm this is the easiest way to do it. It's futile to crawl underneath and hard to reach standing beside the fender. Using a short and medium extension stacked together, it's not quite as long as a long extension, and just like that, there's bolt number 5. Let's use the same reference method for bolt number 1, which you can actually see from the top side, which might help you aim the socket onto it. This time we're using a long extension, which pokes out just enough from the back side of the manifold. I dropped the washer taking this bolt out. Make sure you don't lose those, they are pretty important. Because the layout of the intake manifold is a mirror image from front to back, we'll use the same setup for bolt number 2. Finally, bolt number 4 with the short and medium extensions stacked. You may notice fuel started pouring out of the fuel rail, because the whole intake will tilt away from the engine as you loosen the last bolt securing it. With all 4 lower bolts out, the upper ones are easy. I think it's much better to do it this way instead of removing a lower bolt last, because you can preemptively catch the manifold as it falls off the engine. Make sure to pull outward and away from the engine, not up or down. There are 2 dowel pins on the bottom that usually like to complain a little bit when you take this off. So here's the intake manifold. You want to be careful which way you tilt this because the fuel rail holds a surprising amount of very combustible gasoline. The exhaust manifold is next. I should have mentioned this earlier, but it never hurts to PB these bolts before going after them. Bolts 6 and 7 are actually nuts on studs threaded into the cylinder head, and sometimes said nuts will be seized to the stud and the whole thing will come out when you loosen it. That's okay, it'll just make it a bit more difficult to align the exhaust manifold later, but I got lucky here and both nuts decided to cooperate. With bolt number 3 in the middle, finally the exhaust manifold can be removed. This thing's clearly been on here for a long time, and based on the manifold gasket, I'm fairly certain it's never been removed from the head. So I could very well be the first ever human being to lay eyes on these exhaust ports since they were manufactured around the same time I was born. That means this Jeep at 270,000 miles still has its original 331 cylinder head. So I don't want to hear shit about them being unreliable. But anyway, you can just leave the exhaust manifold attached to the downpipe and get the gasket out from here. We'll next need to clean up the mating surface on the cylinder head, and someone with a lot more professional integrity than me would definitely recommend shoving something in all the ports so nothing gets accidentally pushed down into the engine. However, I literally don't give 2 shits, so with some brake cleaner and shop towels I'll do my best. You could use a Scotch-Brite pad or maybe even some sandpaper, but this isn't a liquid sealing gasket, it's only for air. So the rougher the surface, the more difficult it'll be to seal vacuum. My goal here isn't to make it spotless or perfectly smooth, just get as much leaked oil off it as possible, and remember to do the same thing on the intake ports as well. When the mating surface is clean to your heart's desire, you can install the new manifold gasket next. This one is from Felpro, and I don't believe they're directional. I couldn't find any markings on it, and it seemed to fit no problem, but I could be wrong. Just line it up with the studs and the dowel pins and we're on to assembly. I noticed on my intake manifold some seemingly irregular markings, but they feel just as smooth as the rest of the surface, so I'm guessing that's normal. But before we put that on, the exhaust has to go first, because my tailpipe hanger and all that aren't doing so well. It was kinda heavy and hard to align, but having the 2 studs on either side helps hold it in the proper place. I'll hand tighten the 2 nuts as well as bolt number 3, and now for the tricky part. The 4 lower bolts are pretty much impossible to line up with an intake manifold sitting on top of them. So my clever little trick is to thread each one by seriously just half a turn, not much at all, and then lower the intake to sit on top of them. Far enough out to slide past the dowel pins, far enough in to catch the edge of each bolt's washer. You can then hand thread some of the top bolts as well, and now comes the tedious task of making sure the manifold is fully seated. A long time ago when I first did this, a dowel pin wasn't properly lined up, and when torquing the bolts down I broke one of the runners off. I had to buy a whole new intake manifold, so that's why the one in this video is suspiciously clean. You can only see these things by shoving a camera down here, but this one was clearly not aligned, so lifting up on the manifold and pushing it forward should seat it properly. The top of the runner should sit flush at the top of the cylinder head. Back here, that's clearly not the case, so let's fix that too. As I move the manifold around, I tighten each bolt by hand as I can, slowly but surely ensuring it's on there correctly.
So it took quite a bit of maneuvering, slight adjustments. I've got all of the bolts finger tight now, and just want to go to every intake port and make extra sure that it is fully seated against the head. So there's still a little bit of up and down play in it. That's just because the bolts are not torqued down yet. But before you torque them down, you need to make extra sure that the manifold is fully seated. You can finger tighten the lower bolts by sticking your arm through here, right under the exhaust manifold. By doing that, I could reach every single one all the way to the very back. Before we do anything else, before we start tightening bolts down, the manifolds have a very specific torque pattern by following the sequence on this diagram here.
We start with bolt number 1 and end with number 11. Using the same combination of extensions as before, we torque each of the bolts to 24 foot-pounds. There's bolt number 1 and number 2. For bolt number 3, I couldn't actually fit my torque wrench in here, so I'll quickly remove the throttle body with 4 10mm bolts to get it out of the way. With a swivel joint and a short extension, I torqued number 3, but realistically, you can just do this one by feel with a wrench instead of removing the whole throttle body. Using a U-joint extension will throw off the reading of a torque wrench anyway, so I'm not really sure why I spent the time fitting it in there. Next, bolt number 4 with a short and medium extension, followed immediately by bolt number 5 with the same setup. Now, the two nuts for the corners of the exhaust manifold are torqued to 23 foot-pounds. Honestly, a single foot-pound of difference really couldn't hurt anything, but around here we follow factory specifications. Now back to 24 foot-pounds, bolt number 8, and 9, then 10, and finally 11. Some people wonder how I find this seemingly very obscure information, not only applying to torque specs, but the generally better hidden things most don't know about the Cherokee. I'll let you in on a secret. eManual Online has like a bazillion factory service manuals for all sorts of vehicles. And no, these aren't your cheap shot Haynes books that fail to include entire drivetrain options. These are PDF files of the actual authentic manufacturer provided instructions for example, the 2000 plus Jeep Cherokee. Using this manual, I have access to forbidden knowledge, things even people in the ancient forums never knew, and things the Haynes manual didn't think were worthy of mentioning, like, the entirely redesigned intake used on the 99 plus models. Where the Haynes manual even incorrectly lists model years its information apparently applies to, eManual Online has the original instructions carved in stone from the designers themselves. Like the frickin' main bearing clearance specifications, bro, I don't even know what that means. There's a link in the description that'll discount your own purchase of a repair manual, and you too can notice what no one else notices, and therefore know what no one else knows. Continuing, we can now remount the power steering pump by threading in those 3 bolts, which are torqued to 21 foot-pounds. Slip on the belt and crank it down so it can't twist a quarter turn at its longest stretch between the compressor and alternator, and then secure it in place with the idler pulley bolt. Lower the fan in place, secure the 2 bolts, plug it in, and connect the overflow hose. The fuel line is mounted to the manifold with that 10mm stud, and then simply clicks into place. The safety lock also just snaps right on. Don't forget to snug up that mount stud, and then secure the 2 brackets for our O2 sensor connectors. Now comes the mess of rerouting the wiring harnesses, but before we get that all back in place, make sure to slide the heat shield back over the intake if equipped. Coming off the plastic guide are 2 smaller harnesses, the rear one for all the throttle sensors and the front one for the Bank 102 sensors. Again, be careful with this plastic guide, but it just slides onto the head bolts. And then just start plugging everything in. Here I route the IAT and MAP sensor connectors past the stud shared with the fuel line. These all only fit where they're supposed to go. Up front, the 2 O2 sensor wires go under the fuel line. Sensor 1 connects right here, and of course don't forget the coolant temperature sensor and the second O2 sensor by the oil pan. Now just plug in all the vacuum lines. I'll get the throttle cables vaguely in place, then bolt down the bracket and connect them to the throttle. Finally, the airbox, which as you can see is very easy to install when it's not bolted down. I mean, you probably should have it bolted down, but really it's just a plastic box, so I don't really care. There are 3 bolts on the bottom of it, 1/2 inch, that you can reach with a long extension. And then the battery.
Just one final check. Just want to make sure everything's connected. All your connectors. I got all the O2 sensors. I got all the throttle body sensors. All the vacuum lines. The belt's tight. Oh, let's see what happens. If you see a little bit of white smoke or smell something burning after messing with the manifolds, more than likely it's just your greasy hands. Got some of that grease on the exhaust when we were manhandling it, and as soon as the exhaust gets hot, it's going to melt that grease right off. So that's all that is. Just want to make sure, you know, nothing's on fire. And since I took off the battery, it reset the check engine light. Let's go on a drive. So although my idle is still a little unstable, I feel like that's an unrelated problem, probably a throttle position sensor, but it used to idle like at 1200 RPM, like it would idle like in that range right there, which was way too high obviously, but now that brought it back down below 1000 RPM. Not quite warm yet, so I feel like it'll idle a little bit lower when it's all the way hot. One thing I immediately noticed was how much better the thing engine brakes though. Because with a vacuum leak, you know, it's going to think you're always on the gas, and that doesn't really allow you to engine brake. Alright, the engine's up to operating temperature. As you can see, it's idling right where it should. And I don't hear any intake manifold gaskets screaming in agony. Job well done. Just kind of wanted to take a look at the old one. This is an original factory manifold gasket. It's made out of metal. And there are 2 separate pieces basically. The intake and exhaust are physically detached from each other for the most part. It is still one gasket, but you know, you can see there's a intentional gap left there. And that is because the intake is going to be a lot colder than the exhaust. So, you know, it's different expansion rates with temperature. So, why did this fail? Well, these aren't very common failure things. My theory is that when I put this intake manifold on and I didn't replace the gasket, it didn't really cooperate well with the existing gasket. This is not the original intake manifold in this Jeep. This actually came off with a reclaimer, you know, in my effort to preserve as many parts as I could. I didn't bother taking off the exhaust manifold at the time. I literally just slapped a different intake on it, and I'm willing to bet that because I reused an existing gasket, it didn't really like that too much. And as you can see, there is a whole bunch of debris and oil and whatnot in here, so given that this is probably the original manifold gasket, I am not too surprised that it decided to give up, especially when I dug in there and started messing with stuff. So now I got a Felpro one in there. The Felpro ones are not made out of metal. I don't know what they are made out of, but it's kind of like a little bit squishy, you know, it's a little bit malleable like normal gaskets would be. And because, you know, the Felpro one is built like that, it doesn't need to be separated into 2 pieces like the original factory one. So that should be all good to go.
As always, thank y'all for watching, and don't forget to check out the link in the description to Emanuel Online.